You are listening to Viewpoints from PlaceCloud. Cultural researchers tell stories of places from around the world. For the full multimedia experience and to support the creators you enjoy, visit placecloud.io.
We are at Praça de Córrego da Batalha in the municipality of Jaboatão dos Guararapes. A córrego is simply a stream or a brook. The square marks the beginning of an avenue also called Córrego da Batalha, as well as the ascent to the Guararapes Hills. Everything in the surrounding area seems to reference the Dutch period in Pernambuco, lasting from 1630 to 1654. More specifically, to the two conflicts between the Dutch and the Portuguese, known as the Battles of Guararapes, fought in April 1648 and February 1649. Just a few meters from here are Avenida dos Guararapes, Estrada da Batalha, Rua Henrique Dias and the Felipe Camarão State School, the latter two named after two generals who led black and indigenous troops allied with the Portuguese to drive out the Dutch colonizers. In discussing the departure of the Dutch from Brazil in the 17th century, the turning point is often considered to be the Second Battle of Guararapes, fought on February 19. The larger and better equipped Dutch army, but unmotivated and with little knowledge of the terrain, was defeated by a more agile and cunning Portuguese counterpart. The Dutch had sent 41 ships with 6,000 men to the colony, but the journey to Brazil had been difficult and the mostly German mercenaries were not very interested, had no passion for the cause and were not used to the tropical conditions, wearing thick, brightly colored European clothing and heavy metal armor. In addition, the Dutch had just signed the Peace of Münster with Spain, marking the formal recognition by Spain of the independent Dutch Republic, effectively ending both the 80 Years' War between these two countries and, shortly after, the 30 Years' War, a devastating conflict during which a crippling 4.5 to 8 million soldiers and civilians died in battle, leaving part of Germany with a population decline of over 50%. Meanwhile, Portugal had recently come from under the yoke of the Iberian Union and with a weakened Spain was able to return to colonial aspirations. So, the Dutch coffers were near empty and their appetite for conflict was diminished, while the Portuguese in Brazil, fueled by the landowners' personal interests to see their debts to the Dutch West India Company cancelled, were fighting with renewed vigor. By European standards, the Second Battle of Guararapes was relatively small. Just over 1,000 Dutch forces were killed or wounded, while Portugal suffered only some 45 casualties, in addition to some 200 wounded. The Dutch only left Brazil in 1654, with a treaty between the two countries being signed in 1661, in which the Dutch ceded Brazil, the Portuguese ceded modern-day Sri Lanka, and the Portuguese forked over the equivalent of around 30 million euros in today's currency, though the value of money across centuries is hard to compare. The fact that the Dutch stayed until 1654 and kept harassing the Portuguese in international waters after Guararapes, while also continuing their colonial project in other parts of the Americas, showed that they hadn't given up on empire in general or Brazil in particular. In fact, the successful governor of Dutch Brazil, John Maurice de Nassau-Siegen, after his return to Holland in 1644, was asked on several occasions to return to the colony, which he declined for not receiving the control nor funds he asked for. As an aside, Nassau had also been asked to return to represent Portugal, which he kindly declined. It's not uncommon today in Pernambuco to hear the sentiment expressed that, oh, if only the Dutch had stayed, things would be so much better in Brazil today. Perhaps, perhaps not, and it's impossible to predict with any certainty the course of alternative histories. That said, the Dutch were also pushed out of North America, but stayed in Suriname until as late as 1977. The gross domestic product per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, of Brazil was around $20,000 in 2023. That of Suriname was just over $18,000. For Sao Paulo state, it's notably higher, for Pernambuco lower. Nevertheless, Suriname and Brazil, besides their relative size, are very different countries with very different cultures. So what if the Dutch had stayed? What historically would need to have happened for the Dutch to not leave Brazil? A few smaller events during the 30 Years' War could have run slightly differently, adjusting the timings of a few battles and the resulting truce. The Dutch reinforcements for the Second Battle of Guararapes could have arrived earlier, which would have made them better prepared, probably resulting in the soldiers wearing less cumbersome clothes, resulting in perhaps a defeat for the Portuguese. A stronger position for the Dutch might have made it more likely for Nassau to be willing to return, though the West India Company might have been less inclined to give in to his requests, if they felt they had more of the upper hand. The company, after all, had ended Nassau's contract also because they were a bit wary of his potential aspirations. But had Nassau indeed returned to a more entrenched Dutch Brazil, we're also probably talking about real alternative histories. Nassau was known as the humanist prince. He wasn't a prince yet while in Pernambuco, but he certainly had a keen interest for the sciences and the arts, even if humanist is a bit of an overstatement. Under his command, the slave trade between Africa and America intensified, and Nassau himself benefited handsomely from this. Later, in Suriname, the Dutch were notably less lenient in their treatment of slaves, and the Dutch were quite late in fully abolishing slavery in Suriname in 1863, and even then former slaves were still required to keep working for their former masters for a full 10 years. Brazil, of course, abolished slavery even later in 1888, though the Dutch, in parts of their Eastern Empire, only abolished slavery as late as 1910. But in terms of Nassau's governance, what set him apart is that he was keen on balancing the needs and interests of the different parties in his domains, including the Portuguese landowners, who almost continuously struggled financially. Portuguese resistance against the Dutch kicked off shortly after Nassau's departure, but there is no documentation of this resistance being initiated with Nassau in power in the colony. So it's not unreasonable to consider, if Nassau had returned, that he would have been in a good position to calm the waters and allow for the different colonial factions to again be able to live together to everyone's, except the disenfranchised, advantage. Specifically, a return of Nassau, together with a stronger military mandate in the region, might have seen more geographical consolidation into Maranhão and Bahia, pushing Portuguese forces out. Nassau's religious tolerance is often considered, even if it was not that tolerant in practice, but was definitely more tolerant compared to the previous and subsequent Portuguese administrations. This attracted particularly Jewish merchants under Nassau's first term, and this might have expanded in a second term, possibly making Recife into a financial and trade hub, specifically combined with Nassau's business acumen and his expansion of the slave trade as a driver for economic success in the colony. On top of that, Nassau's interest in natural history, cartography and art might have attracted a broader populace to the capital, perhaps making this Recife into an intellectual center in the Americas. As a consequence, a firmly entrenched Dutch Brazil could then have seen the Dutch becoming a powerhouse in the Atlantic, tightly connecting the northern coast of Latin America, Dutch Brazil, Angola, Ghana and South Africa with European shores. Nassau, in his original term, looked for alliances with the indigenous population, and this was on uneasy footing in the light of the treatment and mere existence of slavery. Depending on circumstances, perhaps a longer duration of a second Nassau term and Nassau's pragmatic approach in general, it's still not likely, even if Nassau would consider sunsetting slavery, that this would be accepted by the more short-term thinking and profit-driven motives of the board of the West India Company. But money talks. If this Dutch Brazil facilitated a flourishing exploitative trade, the directors of the West India Company would support any moves for more profit, even if this would have meant rethinking indentured labor. Meanwhile, the Portuguese Empire would have been weaker. The gold mines in Minas Gerais might not have been discovered or might have ended up in Dutch hands if they had expanded into the continent. Long after Nassau, with a much weaker Portuguese Brazil, with French expansionist dreams around the time of Napoleon, would the French have invaded the Netherlands? Would they have invaded Portugal? With the French revolutionary forces at the Dutch door, the Dutch stadtholder fled to Britain in 1795. The Portuguese royal family moved to Brazil in 1807, just before Napoleonic forces marched into Portugal. Would this scenario have been reversed with a strong Dutch Brazil? That is, if the French would have stuck to their land grabs, would the Dutch stadtholder have moved to Brazil and the Portuguese royal house to Britain? If indeed a Dutch Brazil would have persisted until the early 1800s, it's quite likely that a large chunk of Brazil would then be Dutch-speaking, that Recife would be a major trade hub, perhaps a multicultural society of Protestants, Catholics, Jews, indigenous communities, and Afro-Brazilians. If a Dutch Brazil would have obtained some level of de facto independence during the 1700s, and if the French would still be bent on dominating Europe, Dutch Brazil might have become a safe haven from French expansionism, perhaps resulting in a unilateral declaration of independence, and, if Napoleon would still be defeated, a formal recognition as such at the peace treaties that followed. Possibly, as with other overseas territories, the Brits might have enforced ending slavery in the first half of the 19th century, or this independent Dutch Brazil might have followed the newly independent nations in Latin America, who mostly upon independence also ended slavery. On the other hand, to compare, more recently, both Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, and South Africa saw their white overlords rather atrophy their countries than democratize them. A strong influence by Nassau in the second half of the 17th century might have given a long-lasting impetus for economic pragmatism, relative tolerance, and a focus on the arts and sciences. This could have resulted in Recife becoming an economic, scientific, and artistic center of the Atlantic trade routes, and with access to the gold mines, the exploitation of cotton, coffee, and perhaps rubber could have made this country into an economic powerhouse of the 21st century. Could have. It's nice to imagine these, say, missed opportunities. If only, if only. So what if the Dutch had stayed? As it stands, the Second Battle of Guararapes was a decisive victory for the Portuguese. The mostly German reinforcements on the Dutch side could have arrived earlier and could have been better prepared for battle. Given somewhat different circumstances, the Dutch perhaps could have won, but still at considerable, perhaps catastrophic losses. The Dutch outnumbered the Portuguese, so an even-handed conflict could have resulted in a Pyrrhic, but Dutch, victory. As a consequence, Recife and the Dutch territories in general might have been near defenseless, perhaps suffering continued Portuguese, indigenous and Afro-Brazilian incursions. The Dutch might then have called martial law, pursuing violent crackdowns on dissent. Massacres might have followed, entire communities vanishing. Perhaps Nassau could have been convinced, seen as the only possible savior, to rebuild a city and colony in ruins, but the West India Company's focus on short-term profits and perhaps lesser military commanders out to enrich themselves through plunder and human trafficking would have undermined any attempt at returning to normalcy, if even possible. To undermine the possibility of economic viability, rebels would burn plantations to the ground. Yellow fever and perhaps the plague could have become endemic. Desperate settlers, cut off from supply lines and shunned by the Portuguese, would then perhaps resort to cannibalism in besieged towns. Captured rebels, suspected sympathizers, indigenous leaders would then maybe be executed on a daily basis. The Portuguese, perhaps with the Spanish, eventually would invade, torching entire towns, refusing to surrender to the ground. The Dutch, falling back on tactics used during earlier conflicts with the Portuguese, would perhaps resort to massive scorched earth tactics, turning parts of Pernambuco into a wasteland. Dutch refugees would flee to other colonies in the Caribbean. Eventually, Recife would fall after a prolonged siege. Survivors, afraid of violent reprisals, perhaps would choose to commit mass suicide. Then, finally back in power, the Portuguese would reimpose colonial rule, enslaving or exterminating those who collaborated with the Dutch. Quickly, Dutch settlements would evaporate. Pernambuco, for all its destruction, would become known as a kind of cursed land. Superstitions perhaps would result in sailors avoiding the state and its neighbors. Legends of massacres and roaming spirits might then become embedded in local folklore, the region becoming an economic backwater plagued by poverty and instability. After decades passing, Portugal would move on, facilitating economic growth in the other provinces through gold from the interior and coffee from the south. The Netherlands, crippled by the loss and the subsequent erasure of their transatlantic network, and perhaps the demand for reparations, would have seen their position weaken across the global stage and could slowly descend into political chaos. If this timeline by now had reached the Napoleonic Wars, the European powers perhaps would accept continued Dutch independence at the cost of them fully ceding their colonial holdings, Holland becoming a minor power on the edge of Europe. A sense of societal shame perhaps then would facilitate a national forgetting or even taboo. To lock up a dark past, the archives of the West India Company could then have been sealed or perhaps accidentally destroyed, with historians being forbidden from researching the period and the disaster. Recife, meanwhile, would remain an impoverished, destitute colonial backwater, haunted by a violent and destructive past, with the city's decaying colonial ruins a reminder of Dutch brutality and failed imperial dreams. In the end, Dutch Brazil would only be remembered in horror stories and as a cautionary tale against the hubris of empire. Oh, if only the Dutch had stayed. Of course, we can't know what would have happened in reality. It probably wouldn't have been one of the above scenarios. More likely, it would have been somewhere in between. Somewhere, perhaps, exactly where we find Brazil today. And for all its faults and problems, there's one thing Brazilians tend to happily agree on. Brazil, it's simply the best country in the world.